You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Across the greater Tampa Bay region, people are taking stock of the destruction left behind by Hurricane Helene. A storm surge of 8 feet and more in some places flooded homes and businesses. Tens of thousands of homes and buildings are damaged and some completely destroyed. Some beachside towns look like a war zone after a wall of water bulldozed sand through the streets. And as of Monday, 11 people were confirmed to have died in our community. In the next half hour, you'll hear what recovery looks like as people pick up the pieces after this monstrous storm. But first, you're about to hear the voices of people who experienced the fear and confusion of last Thursday night and shared moments of camaraderie as the water rose higher and higher. Emergency managers warned people in the path of the storm surge to evacuate, but some stayed behind. Stacey Kennedy from Connecticut was visiting her father in Pasco County when the storm hit.
It got crazy because we could just hear explosions all around us. There was transformers blowing up. There was car alarms going off, smoke alarms. You could hear them in all these houses. We had house 2 doors down from us was flashing SOS with their flashlight, but we couldn't get to them. The water was waist deep, and we weren't going to try and cut our way over. So it was quite an experience.
In Hillsborough County, first responders rescued more than 500 people before the sun rose Friday morning. Some people were able to get out on their own, like Saul Marin, who decided to leave around 1 a.m. Friday when water reached his house in the Tampa neighborhood of Town and Country.
We started making moves to leave the area. Even though it was a very quick flooding situation, we grabbed the essentials, obviously the family, the pets, my baby, and we headed out of here. Thankfully, I have a vehicle that that's able to withstand some of this flooding, and we're able to get out, but a lot of people didn't have the opportunity.
Alexis Rivera lives in Town and Country too. He got his family out in a pickup truck as the floodwaters rose and rescued neighbors along the way.
When I was going out, I had a lot of people jump in the back too. I was trying to help as many people as I could. A lot of people walking with babies, dogs. They all got caught by surprise.
Pinellas County first responders carried out more than 500 water rescues. John WUSF and Anne-Louise Abbott helped people take refuge in their second-floor apartment in St. Pete Beach.
There was people walking in the middle of the night at its worst.
Yeah.
This guy had this lady wrapped around him like a kid, and he kept falling in the water, so we kind of helped him up the stairs, and he kind of seek refuge with us. And a couple of people were doing that across the street as well. Everyone was freaking out. Cats were crying out. The street lights stayed on, but they kept flickering.
There was another couple that came from the neighborhood over where the lady's head only stood out of the water, and she had her cat on top of her head, and I guess her husband was carrying all the stuff.
Yeah, he was carrying all the stuff. So they came and brought
they
them
came
up.
up.
In Sarasota and Manatee counties too, Hurricane Helene wrought destruction along the barrier islands, including Anna Maria Island, Siesta Key, Lido Key, and Longboat Key. Now the waters receded, the massive job of cleanup and recovery begins.
I don't know if you've ever smelled the flood smell. It smells like low tide when it's like just rotten ocean, plus just poop, just like rear end, and then just like it's a little tangy as well. And a little smoke from the neighbor's house that's burning down.
That's a St. Petersburg doctor who goes by Dr. Beach Gem 10 on social media. She's emptying out the contents of her own home while posting pithy and practical tips on hurricane recovery on her Instagram. Efforts were still underway to reconnect power to thousands of customers across the greater Tampa Bay region. County leaders and volunteers are working to get people food and set up comfort stations where people can get out of the heat and take a shower or wash clothes. As a row of washers and dryers rumbled in a mobile laundry station in a St. Petersburg church, Pam Lewin scrolled through pictures on her phone of flood damage at her home.
That's a blessing, like you said earlier on, We give thanks in all things because it could be a lot worse. At least we're alive, so thank God for those who are willing to reach out and assist others in times of need.
And as they clean up, people are anxious about the future. In Weeki Wachee Gardens in Hernando County, Kim DeVere wondered whether her 80-year-old mother would have to leave the home she'd lived in for more than 50 years.
It seems to be getting worse, you know what I mean? Like the storms are more ferocious and tough. My dad built additions to their house that they're in, and it's their blood, sweat, and tears are in there, and it's gone.
About 30 miles south in Pinellas County, Candace Redwine was throwing out items from her Tarpon Springs gift shop that was flooded with 3 feet of water. Redwine said she didn't have insurance and was going to be out of pocket about $10,000 to $15,000. Last year, her store flooded during Hurricane Idalia.
I'm sitting here thinking, you know, how many more years is this going to happen? How many more years am I going to have to deal with this? Yeah, it's tough.
WUSF reporters were hunkered down in emergency operations centres as the storm swept in on Thursday night, and they've been out talking to people in the worst hit communities in Tampa Bay over the past few days. You're going to hear from some of them now. Well, let's start with Stephanie Colombini. Stephanie, Hurricane Helene devastated Pinellas County's beaches and barrier islands with huge storm surge, and as of Sunday night, the county was reporting damage to more than 20,000 homes, including some that were completely destroyed. So what have you seen over the last few days, and what have you been hearing from people about the damage?
The sheriff described it like a war zone, and that is, you know, pretty consistent with what I've heard, what I've seen just from going out as far as I could get when the barrier islands were still blocked off, and then, of course, the photos from the beach areas themselves that have been coming out. Just really just total devastation, sand everywhere, you know, up until just today, or, you know, Sunday night, Gulf Boulevard was completely inaccessible, and then in parts. So, you know, just a ton of sand damage from the storm surge, flooding all over the place. You know, people saying all the cars were submerged, that their homes had several feet of water in them. You know, a man talking about it being up to his chest inside. And so you can imagine the flood damage there. And it's really wreaked havoc on the water systems. People are still under boil water notice in some communities because there's just such a massive repair effort to all the pipes and the different drainage systems and everything. So there's just been a lot, you know, debris everywhere, everything you could imagine a storm would cause. And, you know, unfortunately, not everybody did make it out alive. And we know of at least 9 people who have died in the county, and they were all in that evacuation zone A.
Mm-hmm. Now, one person you talked to, and you mentioned this before, this was early Friday morning. This is Andrew Swan. He was watching a friend's house in Madeira Beach. Let's just listen to a little part of your interview.
So you said you were watching a friend's house? Like, yeah. Why did you not evacuate? Did you feel responsible for that, you know, friend's property?
He's a really good friend of mine. He's helped me out a lot. And like I said, we didn't think it was going to be this bad. He always stays at the house. I went over there and I caulked everything up. I did the storm prep, and we were prepared for like a couple inches of water to come in, and just wanted to make sure everything was safe, but we did not expect it to be, you know, 4 or 5 feet of water, you know.
Were you alone? Or
yeah,
was he with you?
No, I was alone.
So, I mean, did you hear this a lot from people that rode out the storm? They just didn't expect it to get this bad?
Yeah, and it's tough because, of course, you know, we were warning people, officials were warning people that this was life-threatening storm surge, that this would be worse than we had seen before. But it's hard to make that connection, I think, when, you know, the Tampa Bay area has somewhat been spared in recent years. When hurricanes have come to this area, you know, we've said things could get really bad, and then maybe, you know, we fared well, better compared to what the warnings were. So I think that might have gotten in some people's head that, okay, well, I stayed for the last one, or I evacuated and then nothing ended up happening, or I, you know, it was okay. And this was not the case. This is like some of the worst storm surge Pinellas County has ever seen. And so this is where those warnings and heeding them really comes into play. I think a lot of people were in shock because they thought they, you know, could handle what was coming, and then were really terrified and distraught to see what ended up happening.
And you mentioned the 9 folks who unfortunately passed away. What more do we know about them?
We know that most appear to have drowned, or at least died because flooding, you know, caused heavy amounts of debris to enter their home and scatter everywhere. So we're still, you know, the sheriff's office is still investigating everything, but it definitely seems like the water was to blame.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jessica, Town and Country, a suburb of Tampa, got inundated by 7 feet of storm surge, and you spoke with Ruth Rodriguez as she and her husband cleaned out their home. Let's just take a listen to some of that.
Ruth Rodriguez and her husband are busy sweeping the muddy waters off of their kitchen tile and out the front door. Their white cabinets and white refrigerator have dirty watermarks about a foot up from the floor. This was a river, and she says it damaged everything.
All right, so Jessica Mazzaris, you were in Hillsborough County keeping an eye on things as the storm came through on Thursday night, and then you kind of got a tip that Town and Country was one of the worst affected areas. So what did you see and hear in your reporting trip the next day?
Yeah, so I hopped into a Jeep so that I wasn't sure what to expect. And I had heard from the Hillsborough County, a public information officer who had said Town and Country, Ruskin, and Apollo Beach were the hardest hit. And I used to live in Town and Country prior to living closer to Carrollwood now. And so I wanted to go check that out. And as I started approaching Hillsborough Avenue, I noticed that Town and Country Boulevard was blocked off by police. And so I figured there was some flooding there. And so I, managed to park my car. A nice resident living there really liked the Jeep, was like, yeah, you can park here. And so, and I put on my boots and my rain boots and started wading through some water to go speak to people. But we do know that in the Town and Country area, there were 2 roof rescues. So there was 2 separate families that were on their roofs waiting to be rescued by Hillsborough County Emergency Operations. And just what I saw was still the water had been receding from the night before, but there was still a lot of water still on the streets, and basically everyone just kind of cleaning up there was a lot of sand and muck in their homes.
Now, so you lived in Town and Country before. What did it kind of look like seeing the image you had of Town and Country before, and then sort of seeing the aftermath of this?
Yeah, it was devastating, and it just realizing like how close I had lived to the water for about 3 years, and just feeling grateful that I moved to higher ground, but not everybody has the opportunity to do that or wants to do that. A lot of people who I spoke to live there 30 years, 15 years, 8 years, never seen any flooding like this before. They said, oh, maybe we saw some flooding in the streets, but never entering up to their homes. And it really is like it's slanting up, the gradient going up toward the home, so it really had to rise up to get into the homes.
So is that sort of part of the reason why Town and Country and Ruskin and those other areas were so hard hit?
Yeah, and I mean, these were areas that were under evacuation zone A, just like Stephanie was saying, and these people, and some people just decided, because they had never seen flooding like was being warned about, they decided to not leave, or some, I guess, didn't have the opportunity to leave. But Ruth Rodriguez, she did leave. She did evacuate the night before, and then a couple other people who I spoke to left in the middle of the night because they had pickup trucks, they had Jeeps they could hop on. One man I spoke to, Alexis Rivera, actually let 8 people onto the back of his truck and got them to safety at like 1 a.m., 2:30 in the morning.
Wow. What did you hear from county officials then about evacuations as the storm came through and in the aftermath? Like, did you get the sense that they felt that they were messaging it effectively?
Well, we do know that I think around 1,600 people did evacuate to shelters in Hillsborough County. But based on what I saw, a lot of people, at least in the Town and Country area, decided to stay home, and we're just not expecting. Like, that's just from my own what I was able to see anecdotally.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also have spent months reporting on people's insurance woes, Jessica, and there's a twist to Ruth Rodriguez's story too, right?
Yeah, so I asked her, and I ask everybody this, did you already call your insurance company, your home insurance? And she said, no, I actually couldn't afford my home insurance anymore. So she recently let go of it. And that's been something that I've been reporting on recently, that the home insurance crisis here in Florida, it's either unaffordable or they're kicked off of their insurer. And some people who own their homes flat out just choose to go without home insurance. It's sometimes a lot easier. It's more affordable. So I had asked her, what do you plan to do now? And she's like, it's in God's hands. What happens next.
Gabriella, you were out and about in Pasco County. Storm surge forecasts were 8 to 12 feet there. Well, that was the forecast at least. So how high did the water actually get?
Yeah, so the water did get up to 16 feet in some places. That's according to Emergency Management Director Andrew Fossa the morning after the storm had arrived. I caught him talking to his team internally, kind of that first morning briefing. It was the third 12-hour shift change that I was there for. And, looking through the window that I had from the media center, I heard him just briefing everybody saying, let's prepare for body recovery today. There was, in some places 8 feet, some places 10 feet, and some places was 16 feet. Fortunately, there's been 0 reported fatalities, but a lot of people did come out with their lives, but not their homes. I did speak to people that said that if this happened again in a couple weeks, they would still stay in their homes. Similar to what Jessica was saying, many people also were not insured, and they were wary of fires that have happened during past hurricanes, and many people said they want to be there if something like that were to happen, especially being uninsured and wanting to protect their property. So, yeah, pretty harrowing stuff.
Speaking of fires, you also did some reporting on some of the fires that broke out. Here's Bruce Archambault, who saw a house in his neighborhood catch fire in the middle of the night while 3 feet of water was rising in his own home.
I could see the light. The whole area was glowing. This home, there's nothing left. They're just going to have to get a bulldozer in here and scrape it out and start over for sure.
So obviously, Pasco County isn't alone in this, right? We hear about the risk of fires and these kind of big flooding events and hurricanes all over the place. So what is it that makes this kind of particularly dangerous combination?
Sure. So when I pulled up and saw this house that had completely burned down, it was one of two that burned down this way in Pasco County. There was a fire investigator there, and he wasn't sure what had happened just yet, but we could see that there was apparently an old Mercedes that was still in what was left of the garage, still smoking. And the time I was there talking to neighbors who were stopping, just curious about what had happened, they had said that they saw it, burning in the middle of the night. And the fire investigator said that a lot of times lithium batteries will reignite with water. Same thing with any house electricity that's left on. I did not see the messaging from Pasco County strong enough on that front about if you're going to evacuate, you need to turn your electricity off. Mm-hmm. I know Mayor Ken Welch in St. Petersburg was backing that messaging pretty strongly. And then also there's just, sometimes open flames, people lighting candles for lighting. That can also be a big cause of fires. But the fire investigator was there. 2 fire engines had come at different times. They were managing putting out a couple of fires. And, relatively Pasco County's structural fire count was pretty low compared to both Hillsborough and Pinellas County. But there was a car that exploded down the road. I think there was a handful of these fires that happened in the Gulf Harbors neighborhood where I was. Mm-hmm. But it's continuing to be a message now from county officials that as people are emptying out their homes, which is what I saw Friday morning, people emptying anything from clothes to dressers to mattresses out on their front lawns, to make sure you're separating those lithium batteries in a container, and they'll be collected separately because of the fire risk.
You're listening to Florida Matters, and a conversation with WUSF's Jessica Mazzaros, Gabriella Paul, and Stephanie Colombini about the impact of Hurricane Helene. Coming up, how the worst-hit communities rebuild, and the storm's environmental toll across Tampa Bay. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. Hurricane Helene devastated coastal communities across Tampa Bay. So what do those communities need to recover, and what's the environmental impact of Helene? WUSF reporters Jessica Mazzaros, Gabriella Paul, and Stephanie Colombini have been talking to people across Tampa Bay as they pick up the pieces and start to rebuild. Stephanie, what does Pinellas County need in the days and weeks ahead as they begin this recovery process?
There's a lot of work to be done, and so lots of support needed, and lots of support already underway, which is encouraging to see. We are definitely still in cleanup mode and assess the damage mode. Emergency officials encouraging people to report and record everything they're observing in their own homes and businesses, to potentially get FEMA aid that, they have to apply for that assistance. The counties themselves are doing, the similar work to see what kind of relief funding they can qualify for. So that's happening. They're still cleaning up tons of debris. You mentioned over 20,000 homes damaged, also hundreds of structural fires. There's a lot going on. So we're still in cleanup mode. The barrier islands are slowly reopening bit by bit, but we are seeing folks who need everything: food, shelter, water, a cool place to stay, clothes, and the community is coming together. The county has, opened up centers where people can go cool off. I've seen
get some Wi-Fi.
Exactly. And just some air conditioning. And there's, mobile laundry stations set up. There's, food relief efforts everywhere. And it's stuff that the actual, government is doing, but then just everyday citizens are really rallying, getting donation supplies together. There's been food trucks all over the place. That is the one positive thing to come out of this, is seeing, the community rally together to support one another. But it's going to take a long time, and we're not even in, rebuild mode yet. It is still very much like cleaning up the damage, getting people back into their homes, seeing what happened, and then, the complicated process of applying for aid that might not come.
Yeah. There's an awful lot of sand to move somewhere too, right?
Yeah. And that's another, Pinellas had been already hit with bad beach erosion from previous storms. There were big renourishment projects underway when the storm was hitting. So seeing what the long-term impact of the beaches have, it's a big source of our environmental protection and what makes Florida great, but it's also a huge source of our economy and tourism. So that's going to be really important. They're cleaning up the sand. What I've heard is that they're trying to get some of that sand is contaminated with all sorts of floodwater, storm debris, what have you. So some of it, is going to not be able to be just returned to the beaches, but they're cleaning what they can. There are special processes for that. So hopefully, some of that can be used to restore the coastline.
Mm-hmm. Jessica Mazzaros, what about Hillsborough County? What do you think the biggest challenges are going to be for some of these communities like Town and Country and other places that you've reported on to build back from this?
Well, I asked Hillsborough County specifically what their focus is on, and as of Monday morning, they had said comfort stations are going to be a big thing. What Stephanie had talked about, a place to cool off, do your laundry, charge your phones. So that's going to be ongoing, and also debris collection is going to be a big one as well. In terms of the local community, Stephanie talked about unity, and it was witnessed that night, the night of the storm. People working together, having people hop on their, and not only just hopping on the truck, but also someone else I spoke to, Saul Maron, he said that he was helping translate with the sheriff's office and the Spanish-speaking community there in Town and Country. And so I think we were already seeing a lot of unity just from that night. So I plan to go back and see how, tell their stories, how they're recovering, and what's needed for that community.
Yeah, and debris collection and cleanup can take a long time, right? I'm thinking back to Hurricane Ian and some of those hardest hit communities. It took a long time to just clear some of that vegetative waste that was left behind.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting, what Stephanie was talking about, the barrier islands, to see what environmental damage, how the toll of the environment has taken from this storm, and because who knows how it's going to change our ecosystems.
And I guess kind of big picture too, as somebody who's been looking into the real world implications and impacts of climate change, this is like one more example of how does a community grapple with this long term?
Yeah, I mean, certainly climate change plays a part in this storm, of course. Sea level rise, the Tampa area has, the seas have risen almost 7 inches in the past 30 years. So that creates like a baseline that's higher for something like storm surge. So if we would have seen the storm surge 30 years ago, it may not have had the same impact as it has had. And then, of course, warmer waters leads to more rain. It fuels these storms to be bigger, like the storm that we saw. This was a very large storm in Helene. And so I think paying more attention to the root cause of climate change is going to be really important, not just constantly reacting to the impact of climate change, but like getting to the root cause of, putting out fossil fuels into the atmosphere, which is heat trapping gases into the atmosphere, and that warms the waters. And of course, it fuels storms like this.
Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned a lot of the folks you talk to have been living in their communities a long time, never experienced anything like this. I'm sure this is going to be a moment for reflection and sort of thinking like how do people try and adapt, or what is their next step going to be when they think about the threat of these storms in the future?
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be a question that I ask people, especially in the Town and Country community who've never seen this before. Like, is this changing? Because some people may not even think about climate change in their day to day, but then they're hit with something like this. And the question is like, do you think about it now? Do you associate this with climate change? But of course, there's just like the immediate trauma of it all and dealing with the aftermath.
Gabriella Paul, what about Pasco County and the communities that you've been reporting on over the last few days? What do you think the outlook is for them?
Well, so certainly the environmental impact is something that's top of mind in Pasco County, actually. The sheriff, the day after, was reviewing and summarizing the rescues and what that was like. But he made mention that in the middle of the night when the storm surge was at its peak and they were doing the high water rescues, he said the smell of gas and diesel was overwhelming. And he said that the environmental impacts are something that the county will have to grapple with. They're just not sure when or how that will come into focus. So that's something that I'll be watching. The insurance crisis is also something that's probably top of mind. As someone that covers cost of living, I'm acutely aware of how something like this could be an emergency that puts people into poverty, homelessness. They might find that they want to move farther east. I mean, I talked to people last year who, after Idalia, moved farther inland into Pasco County. So curious if people will do that, but if they don't have the financial means to, how they'll literally just try to make ends meet. And then I'm also interested in how many people lost their home boats as well. I talked to a few boat owners before the storm, and a lot of them floated down the rivers, and I'm curious how those fared. Apparently,
And when you say home boat, you mean somebody who lives full-time on their boat?
Exactly,
Right.
yeah. I found that with housing costs being so high, more people have found that as a more affordable option to live on their boats.
Mm-hmm.
But with a storm like this, and if they are becoming more frequent and stronger, I'm not sure how much of a viable option that will be. So curious how those folks fared as well.
What makes recovery, I think, especially challenging with Helene is that, sometimes with other hurricanes, there is kind of one clear area that got hit the hardest, and that's where a lot of attention goes. But this storm had just such widespread devastation. I mean, Pinella's talking about this is some of the worst storm surge we've ever seen, but the Big Bend is, just absolutely devastated and has been hit with, some of those communities, 3 hurricanes in the last couple of years. I mean, they're just at their breaking point. And then you go further north and you see the images out of North Carolina and Georgia of communities just wrecked. And so we are going to be all in need of help, and that's going to stretch resources thin, I would imagine, as federal aid has to decide which communities get what and how much. It's not just one area that really saw a lot of devastation. This was a national event, and that's going to be challenging.
Yeah, to Stephanie's point, I mean, some of the conversations I overheard just in the hallways between emergency personnel Friday morning after the storm was already like, okay, a lot of this aid might get focused in the Big Bend region. So how, as a county, are we going to be creative and make sure that, we don't get left behind? I mean, and that was before the storm continued to just barrel north past Florida and really devastate other regions. So I think that's a really, really important point because there are finite resources. And I did have Senator Rick Scott did visit Pasco County before going to Hernando as well. And, I put that question to him. I asked, what can you do from the federal standpoint to make sure that counties in Florida aren't getting forgotten? And he said, really just he's going to make sure that any federal aid is funded. But I think it's top of mind for a lot of Floridians.
Well, I want to thank you all for sharing your reporting with us, and appreciate hearing from you on the ground in Pasco County, Hillsborough, and Pinellas County. Gabrielle Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Stephanie Colombini, thank you.
Thanks.
And Jessica Mazzaros, thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
That's Florida Matters for this week. The executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Jackson Harp. Thanks also to WUSF's Nancy Guan, Steve Newborn, and Mary Shedden. You heard their reporting from Hurricane Helene over the last half hour. Subscribe to Florida Matters wherever you get your podcasts. If you need help after Hurricane Helene, or you want to help those impacted by the storm, there's a list of resources and ways to get involved on WUSF.org. And if you want to share your story about Hurricane Helene's impact on you, look for the Your Voices section at WUSF.org. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.